Welcome to the Great Canadian Piggy Bank, helping Canadian parents raise money-smart kids. Today's episode is for the parents who feel stretched in every direction, financially, emotionally, and culturally. If you're part of an immigrant family and a first-generation Canadian, this conversation is going to feel very familiar. You may be supporting aging parents while trying to raise financially resilient kids, all while worrying you're falling behind on your own future. This is a conversation about moving from survival mode to safety for your parents, your kids, and yourself. My guest today is Parween Mander, also known as the Wealthy Wolfe. Parween works closely with immigrant families and first-generation Canadians, helping them navigate the invisible pressures that don't show up on the spreadsheets: guilt, obligation, scarcity mindset, and the unspoken expectation to hold everyone together. Welcome, Parween.
Thanks, Christi, for having me. Excited to be here.
This is an anxiety-inducing conversation, so I'm very excited to get into it. So, in many immigrant cultures, caring for aging parents is viewed as a moral duty, not a choice. How do you advise clients to manage the internal conflict between that cultural expectation and the mathematical reality that they might not be able to afford three households, theirs, their parents, and their kids?
Yeah, this is a tough one, right? Which is sort of being that sandwich generation where you have dependents above you and you have dependents below you and trying to navigate financially in this rising cost of living economy that we're living in right now. So my first thing that I got my clients to do is that we need to understand the reality of your numbers, right? So first thing to paint the story of how much money do you have coming in, what has to go back out, and then what is left over that we could use as additional resources to help support our parents or that's going downward towards our kids. We need to have that mapping out and that understanding first. And from there, we can make a clear plan of, okay, now that we have these resources laid out, where can we find maybe a little bit more leeway? Where can we find more resources? Does this mean looking into things like splitting and sharing obligations with other siblings if you have them, if you have for your parents? Is this mean looking at things like bringing in additional income so we're able to create a little more space and less scarcity for yourself? So I think starting with an audit of where you are today with my clients and then laying out that financial picture, because I always say we can't argue the reality of the numbers, right?
Mhm.
As much as we may want to change the story there, we can't argue that reality.
Okay, so you've done that audit and you see that they actually do have some room to help
Mm-hmm.
support, but
Mm-hmm.
then lots of adults feel an immense guilt saying no to their parents because they don't have much, because they know
Mm-hmm.
how much was sacrificed for them. So can you share a script or an approach for setting a financial boundary with a parent without it feeling like abandonment?
One perspective I share with my clients is, when we're saying no today to helping with an expense, and obviously there's nuance to this in terms of what that expense is, we're creating space to say yes in the future. Right. So if you're finding yourself
Mm,
in a position where you're just sort of firefighting and always kind of giving money for any type of random expense and not really baking in sort of longevity and maybe some wealth building for your parents, reframing that to saying, me kind of holding on to this money, maybe putting it aside into a savings account for my parents in the future for this other component to ensure that they can pay their mortgage or do these things when they're a little bit older, it allows you to give back more sustainably over time. So that's what I always tell my clients is if we're saying no today, it's actually a reframe for us to say yes in the future from a place of longevity. The other side that I would say when we're having this conversation with our parents is that we do want to try to use parallels. I think coming from collectivist culture communities, this idea of just being brutally honest up front with our parents doesn't actually fly. That's not how we grew up. And so we do need to be a little more subtle in our approach to that conversation. So I always say let's just try to use some parallels, right? That when you first came to Canada, you had to send money back home, and that probably made it harder for you to get ahead here and take care of your family and your parents back home. Can you see how it's a lot of pressure for me now as sort of that next generation, right? And then layering that in with, well, I want to help you and mom in the future, right? But that
mm,
starts with me having some space to be able to build and some savings for me so that I could support you better in the future. Again, coming back to that idea of like he's probably be able to relate to that point. So being a little more strategic in that approach so
mm.
that we don't come across as accusatory or any of the things, but it's really culturally sensitive. And using those parallels that our parents might be able to connect to and say, okay, I see where you're coming from.
How did those conversations normally go? Do they go well?
Yeah, I would say for the most part they do go well, and there's always going to be the time where at first it may come across as a bit of a shock to your parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are tactics that are used by our parents. I would say things like the silent treatment, or the emotional manipulation of "I sacrificed so much for you." They usually throw in their mortality in there
Oh
somewhere.
my gosh.
So all these things happen, but it's also understanding that from their perspective, this is how they communicate, right? They
Yeah.
they weren't really taught how to. Um, Maybe communicate their needs better. They kind of go for more the dramatic side of things. And so for my clients, understanding that nuance is really important. But
Mm.
I think when we kind of layer in those parallels and we try to push back a little bit, our parents at some point do have to respect that.
I find that's fascinating. I mean, I think I have a 13-year-old daughter, and the ability for her to talk about mental health and EQ is far beyond what we ever had. So I can imagine this is just a shock for your parents and other, because they're not used to talking about the money. It's probably more of a
Exactly.
taboo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then so then a lot of parents often try to compensate for their own childhood scarcity by overgiving to their children. How can we break this cycle with our kids without swinging too far the other way and raising them without financial resilience? And do you see that with your clients a lot?
Oh, yes. Like that guilt
Yeah.
in terms of that next generation of like, well, I didn't have these things growing up and I want to make
Yeah.
sure my kids don't experience what I experienced because, again, that really harmed their relationship with money. And so my tangible strategy here is to really list out and be thoughtful about your top priority expenses that you want your children to have access to that maybe you lacked
Mm.
growing up, right? Is it money for extracurriculars? Is it money for that field trip? Having a fun birthday party, or maybe a little bit of a
Mm.
modest clothing refresh for the new school year, right? What are some of those things that maybe harmed you and led to a scarcity mindset for yourself growing up? And then maybe there are larger expenses like university education paid for, right? And having
Mm.
that roadmap allows us to then create a plan and a budget for us to account for those things, right? So I would say having a dedicated separate savings bucket or a sinking fund for your children for those additional expenses could be
Mm.
helpful to kind of create that separation, also a little bit of a boundary for yourself, right? If we're saying
Mm.
yes to every little thing because of that guilt that we experience, we're also not serving them nor us, right? Because I think it is important that we give our kids that financial leg up. But I do agree that financial resilience is a really important skill to learn. And that also means your child does not get every new toy or gadget that they want because they'll start
Mhm.
to then have this relationship with money that maybe may not be the one that you wanted to. Uh,
Love that. And I hear that a lot. It's like prioritizing your family values. So is it education that you value? Is it the
mhm.
friendships, the experiences, and just putting almost like a prioritization and explaining to them, hey, this is what we're going to focus on. I think that's a great idea. Okay. So we want our kids to be cycle breakers, but we don't want to burden them with our stress. This is a big one. How do you
Mhm.
teach our kids about the value of money without passing down money trauma in general?
Yeah, I think the biggest generational change that we can make is just normalizing healthy
Mhm.
money conversations and not money arguments that maybe most of us saw growing up that did traumatize us. And I would say it takes a step forward for those of us that are first gen, that knew the language in Canada, that were very young. A lot of what we did was step in a lot earlier to talk to the banks, to talk to these people in the Canadian system. And so we were overly exposed to adult financial matters at a young age and trying to
Mhm.
navigate that. And so I think the idea of normalizing healthy money conversations and also being very age appropriate with when we do introduce different financial topics, that's probably our most powerful step. And so I do always find that, once your kids start earning money, whether that is an allowance that they receive or, working a part-time job, that is our opportunity to then create some evidence for them, right? Of like how
Mhm.
they can go about managing their money. And so I would say teaching them a budgeting rule, a simple budgeting rule. Like, hey, you can maybe spend 75% of what you earn, but you have to save 25% of that of your allowance for a bigger toy they might
Mhm.
want at the end of the year, or maybe having that discussion with them, like, what would you want to save for? Right. And
Mhm.
getting them excited about this idea of delayed gratification,
Mhm.
and not spending every dollar that they earn.
When I was reading on your site about how you were 13 when you went into a bank with your
16,
parents,
16, a little bit older. Yeah.
16,
Yeah.
still very young, and having to
Yeah.
translate to them from the bank manager that they don't have enough for retirement. That is that is a young age to take on such a financial burden and trauma, because you probably felt it before you said that to your parents.
Yeah, and I think I've shared this before as well. I remember talking to my high school counselor about this idea, and I came
Mm,
in with this sheet of paper that was a budget. That I was like, hey, my parents' income is this, and these other expenses are this. And I remember she looked at me and she went, "Point, this is not your responsibility." But in the moment, I was like, "But there's no one else, right?" So again, this
yeah.
cultural nuance of like, it does. We do have to grow up really fast
Yeah.
given the language barriers, given just, navigating the Canadian systems. There wasn't that privilege of like being just a kid and just kind of going about your high school life.
Yeah.
It was, we were more aware. And that awareness can serve. In my case, it did
Yeah.
kind of make me a little bit more aware about personal finance and wanting to, have money be a tool for myself versus being scared of it. But on the other hand, I'll see time and time again, it does create that avoidance and that lack of safety with money.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is nowhere near on the scale that you have, but I do remember I've been working in video games for 21 years, and it's a very tumultuous industry. And I remember once losing my job and my daughter coming to me, and I sat down and I explained to her, mom's looking for a new job, blah blah blah. And just this fear on her face and her looking at me going, are we okay? Like, are we poor? And I was like, oh, and
Mm-hmm.
I remember just laughing, going, no, no, like, trust, I've worked with this. Like, it's a tumultuous industry. We have emergency funds. We're fine. We're fine. And that just moment, I could just see the relief coming out of her. And it was just such an
Mm-hmm.
interesting, I didn't even think that was going to be a reaction for her. It was just kind of like, hey, I'm gonna be hanging around the house a little bit more.
And I think it goes to shows how in tune kids are, right? Like
Yeah,
they're very aware, like they can pick up on things. And so even for ourselves, kind of being mindful again of the language that we're using, or what we're
absolutely.
saying. Unfortunately, again, we do have to have that mindfulness. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating what they pick up on. Okay, so then, so you talked about this a little bit more, but I thought you talked about this before. But when money is tight, prioritization is
Mhm.
really painful. So if a listener is currently sending an allowance to their parent but has $0 in their own RSP or retirement fund, how do they decide who gets paid first?
Yeah. So I think this comes back to that idea of what we want to aim for here is balance. And we don't really
Yeah.
want to be swinging in one direction over the other. We're only prioritizing maybe your future and then we're totally neglecting them. And then we're only prioritizing them and neglecting yourself. So I think this idea we need to strike a balance.
Hmm.
And coming back to that main topic, that self-sacrificing your financial future means that everyone gets to repeat that same generational cycle of scarcity that we're trying to actively break out of,
Hmm.
right? So when we're giving all these portions of our money away and we're not investing for a future and allowing the stock market to kind of create that return for us and breaking those cycles, again, we get put back in this position where we're just repeating what our parents went through, which is in a very survival mode, paycheck to paycheck,
Yep.
always stressed about money. And so creating that space for you to build on your investment portfolio, establish your savings. Again, this allows you some more longevity, allows you, peace and security for yourself that you do have compound interest working in your name, but
Hmm.
also like for your parents, right? That you are able to give back to them more sustainably over time when we take that space to be like, well, right now I just won't be able to give this, or we reduce the amount. So we do have some money for your own goals too.
Okay, so then you just talked about going into the bank at 16 with your parents. And so a lot of burden is placed on the eldest daughter to be the family CFO. So for the women listening who's currently managing everyone else's financial emotions, how
Mm-hmm.
does she begin to resign from that role to protect her own peace?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I
Yeah.
think it's definitely a journey because one thing that I think a lot of eldest daughters from collectivist cultures were taught was that the idea of like you need to prioritize other people over yourself, and this idea of like, you need to be just a good daughter, a good person, and that meant self-sacrifice. And so we also have to unlearn some of these identity patterns that we were told. But
Hmm.
one thing I have my clients visualize is when they're feeling that guilt of saying no, or maybe not kind of stepping in as that financial savior is, imagine if you didn't exist. What would your family do?
Mm-hmm.
I would bet that they'd find a way to make it work, right? Our parents did it long before we came along, long before we started making money. And so they are resilient. I think we need to kind of keep this in mind. Our parents are resilient. They've shown that with their immigration stories and how they built things from scratch and built a life here for their children. They had that resilience within them. I think the challenge is that, again, we know our parents worked really hard. We know that sacrifice that went in, and we just want to make their lives easier by removing some of that burden and maybe kind of stepping in with our paychecks to support, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think coming back to this idea of like, we're not saying no permanently, We're saying no to create space so that you are able to give back to your parents within a financial plan more sustainably over time.
Mm. Okay, so you've used the term collectivist culture a few times. Can you explain that term a bit more, just to the listeners who don't
Yeah, of
understand it?
course. So, collectivist culture communities are typically ones where you prioritize the many over the individual, whereas Western society is more of the individual over the many. And we see this even translated into the personal finance space, which is we're talking, there's a lot of advice out there about how to save for your own retirement, how to accomplish your own goals, and do all the
Yep.
things, but very little context in terms of when you are managing your parents' retirement, or your parents didn't have those financial resources to rely on, and now you are, responsible for that. How do we actually create a financial plan that works for you within that context?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then you mentioned that immigrant families operate in survival mode. What's one tangible sign that a parent has successfully shifted their mindset from survival mode to safety mode? How do you know when you've succeeded?
Yeah, I think I'm a really big believer that our mindset really shifts when we build tangible evidence for our nervous system that we are no longer living in the past.
Mm,
And like that could be different for everyone. This could be having enough money in your savings account to withstand a layoff. This could be being able to navigate a financial emergency without having to rely on a line of credit or a credit card, right?
mhm.
It could be the ability to take a vacation every year in cash, right? Things that we weren't able to do growing up. And so look for these signals, look for these pieces of evidence for yourself in terms of how far you've come to signal to your nervous system that, hey, we're no longer in that mode, that we can thrive, that we can use money as a tool to live that life that we always wanted for ourselves, and to just have congratulations for yourself to make it that far.
It's incredible. So, final question then, and I'm just more fascinated because you're part psychologist, part financial advisor. It sounds like that is such a huge part of your coaching. Like, how did you come to this, and what is your background to get to this place?
Yeah, I think for me, I always knew I wanted to help people one on one with their finances. But then I started to run into this wall where, I had the advice and you could tell anyone how to budget or, the best debt repayment strategy. But something kept getting in their way of implementing that advice. And that's where I
Yeah.
knew, okay, there's something deeper here. And that's more behavioral, that's more potentially money trauma rooted, more experiential rooted. And then I think on top of that, for myself, I was just someone, in my early 20s looking for money mentors that could relate to my upbringing, that could give me culturally sensitive financial advice, and that just didn't exist. So this all kind of led me on this path to get some accreditations to help myself and my clients with that. So I'm an accredited financial counselor. I'm a trauma money facilitator. I am working on my QAFP, my Qualified Associate Financial Planner designation. So I think for me, education's been a big part of my role in terms of my skill set, so I can help my clients in a more holistic way when we're approaching their finances, both from a strategic lens, but also from that emotional lens, so that they feel resourceful, that they feel like they can trust themselves, and make those behavioral changes to make those lasting changes with their finances.
Thank you. Like, how incredible, and what an incredible legacy you're leaving, and what an incredible journey for you to get here. And I'm sure you're helping so many Canadians because this is just such a part of so many of their stories and the emotional trauma. Like I said, this episode has caused me so much anxiety reading the questions and your life and everything that a lot of Canadians deal with day to day. And you must be such a huge help for so many people.
Well, I would hope so. I think just kind of being vocal and taking up that space in the traditional personal finance space is a challenge in of itself, because a lot of people try to discredit what I'm doing, that there's no reason for me to be talking from a specific lens, that it applies to everyone, that there's this undertone of just not so great things. And so for me to stand on my 2 feet, to be like, no, there is a difference, there is nuance, and I'm going to continue to fight to create that space. Just trying to do my best here, Christy. So I do appreciate you allowing me to come on your platform to share a little bit about my story about that too. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for making time. You're doing an incredible job. Thank you. If today's conversation stirred something in you, relief, discomfort, recognition, you're not alone. So many Canadian families are quietly carrying this tension between duty, love, and financial reality, often without a language for it. Planning for yourself isn't selfish, and moving out of survival mode doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. It means honoring it by building something more sustainable. Parween shared such a powerful reminder that money isn't just math. It's nervous systems and expectations and stories passed down through the generations. And when we slow down enough to acknowledge that, real change becomes possible. You can find Parween Mander, the Wealthy Wolfe, online, and I'll link her work in the show notes. If this conversation helped you feel a little bit less alone, please share it with someone who might need it too. I'm Christi Rae, and this is the Great Canadian Piggy Bank, helping Canadian parents raise money-smart kids.